Florida Crossroads is produced with support from the Florida Department of Education.
Hello and welcome to Florida Crossroads. I'm Beth Switzer. Florida is home to more than 1 million military veterans, and almost a quarter of these men and women are veterans of the Korean War. In this edition of Florida Crossroads, we introduce you to a group of Floridians who served in Korea and survived the Chosin Reservoir campaign, a battle historians have called pivotal to the successful outcome of the war. Though the Korean conflict took millions of lives, it's often called America's forgotten war. A group of men who call themselves the Chosin Few tell us their story in their own words as Florida remembers Korea, the forgotten war.
I've never told my wife any incident. I've never told any of my children. I had stamped it out of my life for 38 years, and I was busy. And now, there's not a day goes by that I don't think about it. And it's right back fresh like it was yesterday.
Korea is as vivid in my mind as we sitting here today.
There's other things that you don't remember. You know, you just did it, but I guess the mind blocks it out after a while. And then there's things that stand out that you'll never forget.
When you involved in something like this, from my perspective, you know, you lose a little bit of your soul. I made up my mind that I was going to divorce myself of that experience.
It was a kind of a culmination of an adventure that didn't seem real, the whole thing. It's just kind of like I dreamed it, a tragic dream.
I was too late for World War II. However, I felt that I should still serve my country.
I wanted that war so bad because I thought, I want to be like that, you know.
The best move I ever made is talk my dad into signing for me and to let me go in when I was 15.
A highly trained and well-equipped North Korean army swarmed across the 38th parallel to attack unprepared South Korean defenders. Caught off guard, they were all but overwhelmed until the United Nations took its historic vote to intervene.
Communist invasion was surprise invasion. No one even expected that at all. No one was prepared for anything. So there was no train, no bus, nothing to ride on to go anywhere. So we just walked and walked.
So I got home very quickly, then we packed everything and we tried to move south, but the bridge was already broken off. So we went up to the edge of the river, and then we come back. And when we come back, the city was already occupied by the North Koreans.
We didn't think South Korean or United States going to be defeated that easily. We were just surprised when in 3 days South Seoul was captured already in North Korean troops' hand. And we totally just horrified.
Did we think we would move up, confront the oncoming hordes of North Koreans with their T-34 tanks, wave the U.S. stars and stripes and scare them to death and they would run? No. Task Force Smith was massacred. Then we knew that we were in for a long, long war.
As soon as they said we were going to Korea, the first thing I had to do was go look at a map and see where Korea was.
I didn't really understand what was going on. Somebody, somewhere, had attacked somebody else, somewhere. And they weren't Americans. I mean, nobody had invaded Los Angeles, or New York, or Florida.
The lieutenant came out and said to us, he said, next month, some of you will be dead, some will be prisoner of war, some will be wounded, and some will be okay. He said, but that's the realities of things.
In the bachelor officers' quarters, you could hear a pin drop. Nobody could sleep. Nobody. We were thinking about a possible fate that awaited us on the Pusan perimeter. We had to hold there, stand or die, stand or die. And so this is what we envisioned. You know, we were going to shortly be a part of that stand.
Most people got seasick, and you know, everything that goes with being seasick didn't leave the ship. It was a terrible experience.
We landed and went in, and I looked around and I said, well, I think I need to go back. I just don't like this at all.
My first impression is, what in the hell are we doing here? Grass huts, dirt roads, no industry, nothing but rice paddies and honey buckets.
The first thing I noticed was the smell. Korea smells like an outhouse.
You could smell Korea 40 miles before you got to the shores.
Korea is a place where they make use of all your human waste by spreading it around in their gardens and fields. So you can imagine what the odor is like.
All you could see were these craggy cliffs, like, you know, rocks. Really couldn't see any vegetation or anything. It was just an awful looking place.
The mountains never stop. They just keep going up, up, up. I said, good God Almighty, I'm going to walk right into heaven. They just kept going.
When we first went ashore, the capital of Korea looked like something out of the 17th century. Everything was primitive. Ox carts and huts and mud walls and thatched roofs.
We saw people who looked like they were 90 who turned out to be maybe 30 or 35.
The thing that made the impression on me was the women and children that were trying to get out, refugees, I guess they were. Children didn't know where their mamas were. And the thing that went through my mind first was, thank God, this is not my country. And I will do anything I can to keep this from being this picture in my country.
We ran across a prison, and there was a terrible odor coming from that prison, and so we had to go up and check it out. When we went out behind the prison, we had found the source of the terrible odor, and it was the North Korean civilians, the men, women, and children that had been massacred. I didn't expect to run into anything like that. It was something that's very difficult to say how I felt, other than tears came to my eyes. I recall there was another fellow with me. We both said a prayer. I normally wouldn't do that, but I had the feeling that somebody had to. These are people that wanted to live like Americans, live free, and they weren't allowed to do that.
We didn't understand the reason we were there, we just knew we had to be there. Home for Christmas. Yeah, that was the rumor flying constantly.
We had the North Koreans whipped. We chased them all the way across the Yalu River up into Manchuria.
This going home by Christmas was mentioned by General MacArthur.
He says we're going to go right up to the Yalu and drive these people out and control the whole country.
And he said, get back on the ship and go around the bottom of Korea, and you're going to land at Wonsan.
We moved up into the mountains from the lower coastline. You could feel it getting colder and colder and colder.
The word cold isn't sufficient. That's not sufficient.
It's like somebody beating on you with a sledgehammer.
In that part of North Korea, the rice don't even grow, so cold.
I still can't figure out how I didn't freeze to death.
As far as shaving, washing, things like that, it didn't happen. We lacked the water. The water we would have would freeze.
But your sea ration would be a can, and it'd be frozen solid like concrete. So in the morning, I would take a can and put it next to my body and keep it there all day. And body heat would thaw it out enough that late in the afternoon, you could open it and quickly spoon it down.
Things just stopped. It was so cold.
All of our equipment that was motorized we let run 24 hours a day. If you shut it off, it wouldn't crank.
We couldn't make rifles work. We couldn't make our pistols work because they were so cold.
The Marines were trained to clean and oil your weapons. You clean and oil your weapons at 20, 30 below zero, they freeze.
So they urinated on them. The idea was to unthaw the bolt actions and so forth.
It was an unpleasant situation, but it was a matter of life or death that they worked. And in a lot of cases, they didn't work.
And we had penetrated up almost to the reservoir when the Chinese ambushed us for the first time. We captured prisoners there in that battle that indicated we're against a new enemy.
60 miles up Chosin Reservoir, that's where I found the Chinese were there. So my job is to report that Chinese are in this area.
They had warned us that they would not tolerate our movement to their border. But yet, General MacArthur took the approach, they don't dare.
We hadn't gotten our cold weather gear yet. And somebody said, what are we going to do for Thanksgiving dinner?
We had Thanksgiving dinner in Hagaroo. It was cold, but the Marines always have Thanksgiving dinner.
They dropped us frozen turkeys. And they dropped us all kinds of Thanksgiving goodies, which were properly heated up, and we had, believe it or not, a Thanksgiving dinner.
We went through the line with our little mess kit, and I got a turkey leg. I love my turkey leg. And by the time I got from the tent back to my tank to eat it, I could have used it for a hammer. It was just totally frozen solid.
Darkness came about 4 in the afternoon, and we traveled all day long in the bitter cold and got up there as the day was waning and had a little time to look over the terrain before night came.
No greenery, just the tall hill jutting up out of the ground. Very desolate place. And we didn't see any people in this region at all, no North Koreans at all.
I forced my men to dig in. They grumbled, they didn't like it. The ground was just frozen hard like tundra. Each soldier had an entrenching tool to dig foxholes, but you couldn't do anything. It's like hammering concrete.
My squad leader said, let's eat the chow, get as much chow as we can because you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow.
Dick Van Nieuwhouse and I were in our sleeping bags, and we were in the foxhole, and it was dark. And we heard this horn, and I told him, wow, it sounds like a Greyhound bus. And he says, what? He says, I said, sounds like a Greyhound bus coming. He says, how could a Greyhound bus come down this little road?
It was after midnight, and I just started taking my boots off when I heard the crackle of firearms fire up the river. Bam, bam.
Yelled to the troops, I said, knock off the machine gun and use your rifles. And they did, and everything quieted down for a moment, and then all hell broke loose.
You talk about sound.
The screaming and the loud voices, not understanding what they're saying. And then the sound of mortar shells coming in. They sort of have a screaming sound. We call it the death sound.
We heard the whistles, the horns, the banging, then it came.
Lieutenant, there's something going on up there. And I rushed and got my boots laced back up again, and I just got out in time. And I saw a wave of Chinese coming in. And I grabbed my carbine, and I ordered them, get your weapon, get in your defensive position, fire, fire, fire.
They just swarming all over the place. We don't know how they got so close to us without us seeing, knowing they were coming. They were just everywhere.
We were in close combat using rifles, bayonets, butts on our rifles, and even used trenching tools.
They wanted to get to the officers, and so they just, some of them ran right past us. I could have just put my arm out there and tripped a couple of them, But if they would have turned around and then come after me, I would have been dead.
I laid down behind a big pile of dirt. I had my weapon with me. I looked out, but it's pitch black. And then we began to see shapes. I could not discern a figure. It would be like a ghost in the dark. And you begin to see them coming. And they're coming all over.
And that entire valley was ablaze, and we were sitting on top of the hill, and we could literally see the hundreds of Chinese that were moving towards us like an army of ants.
I don't know if I had a target when I shot, but I knew that somebody was coming to hurt me, and not Mrs. Iron's boy.
We had a lot of hand-to-hand fighting, and they were raining potato masher grenades everywhere.
And I heard a yell from my mortar platoon, which was in a dry riverbed. And they yelled that they were receiving small arms fire, and I told them, wait till they get close enough to where every bullet counts.
They forced me back through my own mortars back to our company command post, where my company commander, old Earl H. Jordan Jr., I looked at him, and his face was bloody all over, and he was in there, had an M1 rifle, and bayonet lunging away at the Chinese and butt stroking them, and he was in tears and almost tears of what was happening to his unit. But he was fighting like a darn demon, setting an example.
And I went around in front of where we had been attacked from, counted 67 dead. And we captured, I think, probably a half a dozen. That was the first night fight.
We got through that night, and when dawn broke, they pulled back. And I can only say this, there were bodies everywhere.
We had prisoners. And I went to look to see who the hell caused all that trouble last night.
They were dressed in quilted outfits.
They wore sneakers at 40 below zero. Some of them walked on stumps, not feet.
I recall seeing the Chinese prisoner on the road wearing tennis shoes. And because of the perspiration, his feet were literally coated in ice. He had no gloves, he had no earmuffs. So these poor volunteers were essentially what we saw in terms of the Chinese.
We'd come upon some Chinese whose hands were frozen on their rifles. They had to break their fingers off to get the rifle out of their hands. Cold will do that. Cold is a killer.
Our tactical air support in the daytime would fly over and tell us they didn't have any trouble knowing where the outer edges of our perimeter were, because they were marked with all these Chinese, piles of Chinese dead.
You couldn't hardly believe what you were watching. Here were people dying right down there, and you were only 100 or 200 feet above them, but you could see them firing at each other at almost point-blank range.
We went out the next morning and picked them up. Their bodies were already frozen, and we just laid them in like a wood pile on top of the ground.
Death came so instantaneously, it was just very difficult to accept it. But when you start stacking the bodies up, you realize that it was for real.
There's one thing that I can't erase from my mind, and that was the bodies of American soldiers stacked up like cordwood, frozen. That can't erase that from my memory.
What the Chinese wanted was that logistic base at the south end of the reservoir, where the Marines had all of their resupply of ammunition and food, fuel. That's where the evacuation hospital was. That's where the Marines command post was.
The second night, it was same thing, only worse. Third night, they overrun us and got in our perimeter.
They came from the west, they came from the east, they came from the north, and they actually, in some places, overran us.
We were attacked about every night after that, same old thing. Wondering what was going on, how we were going to get out of there, if we were going to get out.
They never gave up. I mean, we're just killing hundreds of them, and they kept coming.
parts of their units would be without arms, maybe carrying nothing but hand grenades. And their resupply was to be the weapons of the soldiers that fell.
The only thing going through your mind is that they're going to win eventually because they got more people and we got bullets.
A lot of the wounds were horrendous. Minor wounds were left outside and covered with straw until they could get to them.
There was no way of evacuating out of there. In other words, if you had casualties, you had to nurse that patient and keep them alive until you could get them out of there.
Our General O.P. Smith had disobeyed orders. He was told not to cut an airstrip. He cut an airstrip with our engineers anyway, so twin-engine planes could land, and almost 5,000 soldiers and Marines were flown out who would have died up there, frozen to death.
The ones who were bleeding badly, and we could not stop it. And we would give them lots of blood, and they would do what they could there. That was one of the hardest things, was to see what we could do for our patients, and sometimes we just couldn't do anything.
If you've got somebody's life in your hands, and you're able to maybe take him out and save his life, and your own, I don't think there's any greater feeling in the world.
When we were in the perimeter, we were cut off logistically. Chinese were all around us. There was no supply by road, and we had to be resupplied by airdrop. But the problem was our perimeter was quite small, relatively speaking, as a target for the drop.
Some of it got into enemy hands because the drop was not perfect or the wind was in the wrong direction.
Some of the things that were asked for, such as water, they may drop gasoline instead of water. And the ammunition they dropped sometimes was the wrong type of ammunition.
A lot of us suffered casualties from our own ammunition that drifted into enemy hands.
What upset me the most was a lot of our equipment didn't work. We didn't have the right clothes. We didn't have the right food. We didn't have hardly anything to eat. And all of a sudden, I'm beginning to have second thoughts about my great American Army.
It was a manifestation of Murphy's Law. Anything that adversely could happen did happen.
Of course, there is a funny story. In the services at that time, the 60-millimeter mortar had rockets which they were called Tootsie Rolls as a code word. Somebody called back and said, quote, "Send us Tootsie Rolls," meaning send us 60-millimeter mortar ammunition.
When it was being dropped, we thought it was ammunition being dropped into us. They pushed it out of the back of the cargo plane. Then these cases start falling through the air.
Vroom, 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 vroom. Down come the crates. You know what we got, don't you? You ain't kidding. Tootsie Rolls. Millions of Tootsie Rolls.
And you picked up and put it in your pocket, and you put a piece between your chicken gums, and after about 15, 20 minutes, it got soft enough that you could chew it.
The funny part about it was, we subsisted. It was sugar.
And so that served as food until we finally got to Ham Hong.
In Korea, the United Nations victory that seemed certain becomes retreat as 1 million Chinese Reds invade Korea from the north. It is 60 miles from the Changjin Reservoir on the Hagaru Plateau to the escape port of Hungnam. The 15,000 encircled at Hagaru must fight their way through 100,000 Reds and down an ice-glazed, winding mountain corridor to Hungnam. But they are still surrounded. To fight their way out, they need a miracle.
When the word of our encirclement by Chinese came out, the brass in Washington had deemed the 1st Marine Division to become a total fatality. They wiped the division off as being impossible to rescue. We had a chaplain, and at that point he had a mass out in the field. And he said, "Now, this is probably your final benediction." He says, "Because possibly Some of us, many of us, or maybe all of us, will not see each other until we reach heaven. We really didn't take it to heart, because General Smith says, retreat, hell, we're just attacking in another direction.
Colonel Faith decided that really he had two alternatives. He could stay there and continue his defense, or he could go for broke.
Nobody came out and said, this is an order, break out. You just kind of, it's just kind of trickled down, and you knew it was coming.
So we really only had a half a day just of daylight to start this breakout attack, but we couldn't wait. There wouldn't be any tomorrow.
There was no way we could bring the dead out. If they were wounded, they were put in a truck.
We loaded our wounded. We had more than 400 wounded that had to be evacuated. We couldn't leave them there. We couldn't abandon them in the breakout. We had to somehow take them with us. And there was only one road leading back to Hageree, 8 miles south, which the Chinese controlled. And these were wheeled vehicles. You had to use that road, and you had to take it away from the Chinese.
And it wasn't until I saw them loading up trucks with wounded people and so forth that I realized what was happening.
We were stripping clothing off of our dead to keep our wounded loaded on the trucks warm.
And they had a lot of bodies in there, people that are dying and people that are alive and people that are dead.
I was one of those people walking behind those trucks, and I'll never forget those trucks. And I forget how many trucks there were full of dead Marines, but they told us at the time that it was 87 miles to the beach and the coast, and we were going to walk to it. After seeing all those dead Marines in that truck, I said to myself, I'll walk every inch.
The next day, they start withdrawing the whole works, the Marines and us both together. The enemy were coming down through the gullies and so forth, and we were constantly firing at them all the time, all day long. We had about 1,000 civilians behind us, following us, you know. They were women and children and so forth. So I felt sorry for them. I mean, they were freezing and so cold that, you know, you wouldn't believe it, how cold it was.
After we left Hageree going south, we'd be moving along very slowly, and guys would just keel over. You rush to them and roll them over, and their eyes roll back in the head. That eventually died. They just froze to death.
So we were so run down and hungry and tired when we started out. Most of the men didn't have a lot of energy. They were just going on plain guts.
But a miracle does come to pass as these Marines reach Hungnam, its harbor packed with Navy ships. Here, under enemy guns, 105,000 troops are taken safely off the beachhead, along with 90,000 refugees, 18,000 vehicles, and 1/3 tons of supplies. It is a feat without precedent in warfare, a fitting climax to the saga of bravery written in the blood-stained snows of North Korea.
I must say, those men, they did one heck of a job. I don't even like to dwell on it. It hurts. But they were great. They were great American soldiers.
We say it's like brothers, but I think it's deeper than that. It's life itself. You depend on them and they depend on you. You just do your job, not because you're brave or anything like that, but the job has to be done.
There was no big welcome home. Most people didn't even know where I was gone to. You know, the rest of the kids I knew in school, where you been? I ain't seen you in a while.
Well, they call it the Forgotten War, and I just forgot it.
I was one bitter SOB. I was just bitter about the war, getting shot up, and nobody gave a damn.
Then when I went to town the next day, the first guy that spoke to me was a World War II veteran. He says, well, Norris, I haven't seen you for a while. Where have you been? I said, well, I just got back from Korea. And he says, oh, that. Well, that kind of made me do a little, because of the sound of it, you know. And then he says, How was it over there? It wasn't really as bad as the paper made out, was it? Because after all, that wasn't a real war. And when he said that, I said, I don't know, I didn't read the paper, and I just turned around and walked away.
I think American people, on the whole, don't like war. I don't like war. I think it stinks.
Did they understand at the time? I don't think a lot of them did. It was a United Nations police action. It wasn't a declared war.
As far as I'm concerned, World War II, in my case, didn't even come close to Korea.
And over the years, people have said, but you didn't win that war. We did. When we went over there to stop North Korean aggression. We did that. We put them back in North Korea. So we won that war.
Nobody can defeat the army of a free people if it's properly recruited and oriented and understands what the stakes are. Nobody. And I have absolute faith in our Constitution and the American people. And we have a responsibility to educate our young people, to help them realize just how precious their legacy is.